You know that he just told me he's on his way to Los Angeles to receive.
I'm going to be. I have to tell this story, David.
Yes, please do.
Some of us grow up hoping to get the Nobel Prize or the Pulitzer Prize or the National Book Award. I don't know what I grew up expecting, but I'm going to tell you that this Saturday night in Hollywood, I'm going to be awarded the Anne Radcliffe Award for Literature, given by the Count Dracula Society. Back to you.
Well, that's, I think, probably the best introduction that that either one of us could offer at this point. So,
Okay. Am I on my?
Yes, you're on.
I'm on my own. Okay. David is an old friend and colleague. I haven't seen him in 8 years, so what you saw as you watched us, we were, patching up the past together. I haven't yet a thoroughly clear idea of what you expect from me tonight, so I'll do what I usually do, which is to give you almost everything I can in the time allowed that in some way illuminates first my life, my work, and the process of being a writer. The woes, the trials, the tribulations, the rewards, because I gather that Bay Area Writers is the name for the series, and that you yourselves must hope to get some kinds of clues about the genre writer and the life of the writer. Immediately you see sitting before you someone whose destiny took a very bizarre turn a few years ago, though it's possible to argue that one's entire life is a bizarre turn of destiny. And sometimes in more serious moods, that's precisely what I would argue. The specific thing I'm trying to crank myself around is talking about is the sudden intrusion into my life of the idea of Dracula. The idea of Dracula. Some 6 or 7 years ago, after I had done a very serious, and I still think very, very moving and important book about Israel, I was exhausted. That happens when you finish a book sometimes. The analogy between making and not making babies, that's easier for men than giving birth is for women. But you deliver the book and suddenly you're exhausted. Whew. And so there's this weird plateau of time and feeling where you're wondering, what are you going to do next? And it's very intelligent, particularly for writers, to have more than one project, one intense project and 5 non-intense projects, so that after the intense project is over, you can fall back on a non-intense project and sort of let your motor idle for a little while. So while my motor was idling, I was thinking, since it was the period when the counterculture, was just stretching itself and and flexing its muscles, and students were dropping out of college at a great rate, and they were complaining that we were not teaching anything that was relevant. And since I teach Chaucer, who could, my students are among the first to say, what's relevant about Chaucer? And the answer is always everything, and sooner or later they come around to knowing that. Meanwhile, in my sort of left-wing mood, how shall we please these idiot students? It occurred to me that we might make a textbook for freshman composition on Dracula. Instead of what did you do for your summer vacation, we would encourage freshmen writing on Dracula. Well, I proposed this to my publisher, and he said, oh, come on. They sneered at the project altogether. And they were right. It was pretty dumb, though I must tell you that since then, several academic people are putting together books on freshman approaches to Dracula. But that's another story. But, said my editor, we don't like this idea. Are you serious enough about Dracula to doing a serious book about it? And I said, I don't know. I went to the library. And that's another thing, You never know which of yourselves is lurking underneath your own skull. Had you asked me, literally, a month before then, could you get so excited that you would spend a couple of years making a book about Dracula? I had envisioned patching together some questions, on What did Dracula do in chapter 14 to Minna that is repeated in chapter 19? The sort of things that college, academics can do. I went to the library and started reading the history of the vampire. And, of course, rereading Stoker's Dracula. And something like a mystical seizure took place. And I must tell you that I do tell you that that mystical seizure happened something like what we imagine a prophetic experience is supposed to, when it overtakes a prophet. It's easy to claim too much for this book. I don't mind claiming too much for it at all. It's a strange book. It disappointed many reviewers who don't know what to make of it, because it's not about Dracula. It's a book with Dracula in the title, and it has a long chapter on Dracula, chapter 6, in which Dracula is, an explication de texte, in which I do my best to present the implications of the novel Dracula to our own time. But that isn't the full either intent of the book or, as I think, its full achievement either. This book is a collage. It's a collage of attitudes, responses, anxieties, and illuminations that I've had about the United States in the 70s. What it's like to be an American in the year 1970-72, because that's the epoch that this was taking place in. You'll get some idea of what happened to me if I just run through the chapter headings and tell you a little bit about what's going on in this book. Chapter 1 is called Energy Without Grace, the Atavistic Revolution. A theory grew in my head as I read more and more about the vampire on the one hand and about our own epoch on the other, that the image of the vampire was beginning to be indeed pressing on the consciousness of most of us as a symbol that represented the epoch itself. To give you the shorthand term for it, I now give a lecture in another context, I will not give it to you tonight, called Dracula, Patron Saint of the 70s, and then I put a question mark at the end of that title. That's deliberate because I really don't want the various churches to be up in arms against me for asserting that Dracula is the patron saint of the 70s. So in a piece of mock modesty, I put the question mark at the end of the title, and that there, can squirm out of any kinds of pinpointed inquiries into what I really mean. What I really mean is that Dracula is the patron saint of the 70s. You're welcome to have that as a piece of information. The book is a first-person narrative of Wolf as he moves through his own history and the history of the 70s as they join the history of the vampire and the history and the consequences of the industrial age as it comes to be experienced at the end of the 18th century. What a strange thing to do. Really, what a strange thing to do. I had no idea I was going to do it. That's the point. I had no idea I was going to do it. I thought I was going to sit down and make a study of the novel Dracula. It didn't work, so that you find out how I lost my virginity in this book. And that, I'll tell you if you want to know. It's not hard. I mean, it was, never mind. Losing one's virginity is not that unique an experience, though you wouldn't believe where I lost mine. Maybe you would. It's by way of saying that I tried to join the symbol. The central point that I made is that the bloodthirst, the blood consciousness, mind you, the book was written when Vietnam was still very, very much part of our ongoing life, that blood consciousness is where our American psyche was. This is one of the you know, this is a photograph of a military cemetery not far from here, a military cemetery to which I hope you'll all go sometime to sit quietly. You will not have macabre thoughts, I promise you. It's one of the more beautiful things I've ever learned to do as a consequence of these various researches. I will sit in cemeteries comfortably for periods, you know, an hour or two, and I strongly recommend it. You'll come back with a deep sense of love. I promise you that. There's nothing macabre about sitting in a cemetery, if you go to it with the humanism which I recommend. I have a chapter on Gilles de Rais. Gilles de Rais, who is a mystery, an extraordinary mystery, a 15th century colleague of Joan of Arc's. He rode with her. They were companions in arms, a magnificent warrior, the soul of honor, the ideal of knighthood. Beautiful, blue-eyed Gilles, as I've called him in this book and in other places. I said of him that Gilles tested to the last detail the full egotism of the Dionysiac vision. In that Nietzschean world where supermen will recognize each other, in disregard of the trivial clamor of lesser mortals, the austere, the brilliant, the demonic, and saintly Gilles de Rais will undoubtedly have his honored place. And then I'm going to leave out the rest of that sentence to tell you a little bit about him. Gilles is important to me because among all of those positive attributes that I gave you, we now have to add that Gilles is one of the world's great mass murderers. He murdered between 200 and 800 children, mostly boys, though occasionally when boys were not available, he could content himself with the exquisite disemboweling of female children as well. He's a study in exquisite ferocity, a study in deliberate evil, deliberately and sustained over a long time. I have to ask you to consider that I'm fascinated by, determined to understand evil, and that evil, as I understand it, has to have a quality of time in it and a quality of decision. Reiterated over time, the decision to do something appalling, ghastly, and awful. Gilles was all of those things and is superior in interest to Vlad Tepes, who is the historical Dracula, who murdered many more thousands of people than Gilles did. But Vlad was simply a sadist who killed people because it satisfied his grosser lusts. Okay, the difference is that Gilles was in a constant dialogue with God. While he was busy disemboweling children, he was also building chapels for the worship of Christ and praying in them devoutly, profoundly. It's that complexity. Don't make any mistakes. The research that I made on Gilles de Rais changed my mind utterly. I used to be a devout anti-capital punishment believer. After I finished the study on Gilles de Rais, I now believe in a society's right not to punish murder, but to avenge dead children. Vengeance is also a legitimate societal gesture when provoked at the extraordinary level that Gilles provoked his society. He got away with it for 10 full years. What's more fascinating, more fascinating even than the things he did, and I love this complexity in all of us. Don't mistake me. I don't think it's wonderful. I love the complexity. I believe that we are all very complex creatures. The next complexity I want to put before you is the complexity of the henchman. Gilles was bad enough, but where did he get the people to whom he could say, I need 16 boys tonight? And somebody said, yes, sir, and went out and found them. Where did he get the old women? Women who stole babies for him. He found them. That fascinates me. Every major criminal has a henchman or henchwoman. And the hench person fascinates me. There's always some second-rater who's willing to give the monster what it wants or what he wants. We need to worry about that because our capacity to be huge, grandiose monsters may be limited, but our capacity to be henchmen is not limited at all. What is Hannah Arendt calls it the banality of evil. Well, and she's written a splendid other book about that. So I have a chapter on Gilles de Rais because I wanted to get this into our consciousness. I wanted myself first and then the rest of us to think about how close as Americans we were to a willingness to support monstrosity as long as it was interesting. We support it nightly. Somebody has estimated that 12-year-old children see something like 18,000 murders committed on the tube from January to December 31st. Well, you know, 18,000 murders, so what? And, you know, I reached a stage of what do you call it, when you no longer have feelings? Insensitivity? No. Not apathy. I'm never apathetic. But there's a, what? There is a word. Indifference. Thank you. I've reached a stage where now when I watch Cannon, what really breaks me up is the crunching of those automobiles week after week. The people no longer interest me. All that metal being destroyed. Now, you know I don't mean that. But it gives you some sense of how we do become indifferent. Deaths are a metaphor on our TV screen. Let me come back. Gilles then was one of the models that I wanted to obtrude to our attention so that we could confront them. Because, of course, the heartbreak of this book and this book is that none of the monsters I'm interested in, and I'm interested in them all, is any worse than any of us might be if we were given the chance. My 13-year-old daughter thinks that what I've just said is terrible. She thinks it's a ghastly thing to say and that it's not true. And I wish she were right. But my sense of us, and we have historical evidence for it, is that given the right provocation, and it doesn't need to be very much provocation, a mere enticement, and we can turn into murderers, sadists, with delight. With delight. Just let us do it, and we will. What does that mean? Does that mean that we're horrible, or that we have an option? I suggest that we have an option to control our natural impulse to be as ghastly as some of us occasionally are. In any case, that's what this book is about. I have an encounter group in it. Now, why an encounter group in a book about Dracula? Because in this encounter group, the encounterees have one of their members who is a young woman with a humpback. She's a humpback. She joins the encounter group really because she's lonely. And the truth is that lots of encounter groups are very nice places to meet people. That's the best meaning of an encounter. You meet somebody. And so she joins the encounter group, and I won't read the whole scene to you, but as she is there, it's her turn to be the person in the middle. And let me see if I can find it for you. It really requires your attention. You would think I would know where it is, wouldn't you? David knows that among the other problems I live with is that I have a desperately bad memory. And I don't remember not only what I've said, but what I've written. So, yeah, I think we have it. Here we are. She's at the encounter group in Burlingame. Well, why not? And it's a sort of, they're sitting beside the pool, the swimming pool, and the director of the encounter, whose name is Dr. Dodson, has her standing up in the middle of the group, and she has been asked to tell the group who she is. And she says, I don't know. And one of the people at the encounter, you know, brutality is one of the things you're encouraged to do in some of these groups, says to her, cut the crap, you fucking well know who you are. Betty, remember, this is a 26-year-old, hunchbacked young woman. Betty, startled by the venom in his voice, turns toward him, the tears not quite gathering in her eyes. She says, I just thought, we know damn well what you thought, comes the clear contralto voice of a slender, brown-haired woman of 30. This is Lois, who teaches 12-year-old girls at San Francisco's Burke School. You thought, poor little me. Here I am, Miss No Name of 1971, weeping and crying, and all of us nice, nice people will pat you on the head and say, there, there, we love you. Isn't that what you thought? And Betty thinks, awareness, she thinks, aware. And she sees her own silhouette, hunched and long as if draining toward the pool. The moonlight, too, is her enemy. One after the other members of the encounter group shout cruel and horrid things at her until finally one of them says, Dr. Dodson, when she starts to cry, says, crying, Betty, is evasive, you know, nearly as evasive as telling a lie. And then Pete says, why don't you tell us who you are, because you do know. And she, in despair, cries out, I'm a freak. And then the other fellow says, her dinner table friend says, what's a freak? Me, says Betty, I'm a freak. Do you really believe that, they say? And I'm going to abbreviate this because, though I love my own prose, they make her take her clothes off, piece by piece, till she stands revealed, naked and hunchbacked in the light of the poolside lamps. And the doctor says to her, you do have the hump, don't you? Well, do you see it? And she says, it's there. Do you think I don't know it's there? Betty, he says, a question is not the same thing as an answer. Now try to answer our question. And as I say, they make her take her clothes off, and then one by one they gather around her and they pat her hump. In their terms, let me tell you the language that I think their sense of what they're doing is this. She's thinking, I am a naked monster statue in a fountain with my arms folded and my legs pressed close together. I am cold and humped. I am a naked monster statue in a fountain. I am cold and humped. And then out of the shadows the others come for the encounter. Betty no longer sees them. They are all a white blur moved by the wind. One by one they come toward her. One by one they put their arms around her naked body. But she does not feel them hugging her, nor does she feel their hands exploring, patting, reassuring her hump, reassuring her. 14 strangers on a moonlit hillside are giving her an intimate message. Betty, 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 you are like us, hump and all. We are all cripples. We are all straight. We love you, Betty. We love you. Can't you tell? Now, I don't think they loved her at all. I think what I saw there is a coven of vampires who came out of the shadows to steal each other's energy from each other. They got a great high out of that experience. And it is a high, burrowing into someone else, exposing the other for a moment so that you don't have to expose yourself. I find that a form of vampirism, and I included it. I also included a scene that some of you seem to be too young to have experienced, and that, of course, is the great concert at, what was it? The Rolling Stones concert? Altamont. The entire Altamont thing is included as a chapter on vampirism, with the chief vampire being, of course, Mick Jagger. Many of my students were very unhappy with me for that, but I won't reiterate why I thought that whole thing was a vampire scene, but I certainly thought it. Finally, the book, then, having gone through all of these elements, the Hell's Angels are in here. The Industrial Revolution is here. A variety of other things, making my central point that the American consciousness has reached a curious state in which if you tried to find a single image that represented it, Dracula is it. Before I read you my serious prose, I must remind you that to this very minute, younger children than yourselves are buying or being given for their breakfast a cereal called Count Chocula. Never mind that the cereal is blood-colored. Never mind that each of them is a little round circle with a cross in it, which is a parody of the communion wafer. Never mind all that. Yes, not no. Go look. Go look. And I wrote to the people, you know, I wrote to the advertising agency, asked them to explain to me why they would choose such an image. And they said it had an upbeat idea behind it. In Yiddish, we say, euch mir an upbeat, which means also me an upbeat. I don't know, that doesn't translate, does it? There are 4 elements. I'll summarize them very, very briefly. Dracula contains in himself 4 elements that vibrate on the American scene. A fixation on youth. Dracula, you recall, he's young as long as he can get to drink somebody's blood. The more he drinks, the younger he gets. That's true. If you read the novel closely, as I've had to, you find that as his intake increases, he gets younger and younger. Toward the end of the book, he has black hair. At the beginning of the book, he has white hair. Never mind. Yeah, it's clear that I'm not drinking blood. That's really all I wanted to say. Youth, death. We have, if I may call it, a counter-fixation on death. We like not to recognize it. We like to pretend it doesn't happen to us. It happens to somebody else. And when it happens, we call in a makeup man. That's what funeral homes do for the dead, you know. They lay them out. They make beautiful corpses. I have an entire chapter on death in this book, of which I am inordinately proud. Inordinately proud because I tried as hard as I could to confront the real and finally the stinking reality of death. Unless you have smelled the dead, you cannot get 2 things. You cannot get an appropriate sense of the appalling finality of it, nor can you get an appropriate sense of hopefulness about the biological reality of it, which means that it nourishes the rest of the world. Dying is a form, as the great writers have always known, of living. But until you can feel its stink, you evade the responsibilities of real life. You have to feel the finality of death in order to enrich the daily life. Learn to die, as says a famous medieval sermon. Learn to die. If you cannot learn to die, you cannot learn to live. I have been thinking lately that one of the ways to cancel all violent movies at once is if we invented a camera that also transcribed smells. If you could smell the blood pouring out of somebody whom you have just shot, you might turn your TV set off. Color, I suggest to you on the TV screen, inures us to the ultimate consequences of violence. Bleeding people on TV color look good. If we could smell it, we would not be so sure. And that's what chapter 3 is all about. And I interviewed a number of dying people and learned a good deal about the nature of courage in that regard. Okay, youth and death, and of course violence. Violence is the ongoing delight of this age. Not much more, may I say. I don't like to suggest that the 20th century is more violent than all other ages in terms of its intake. I know something about the medieval world, and it was a damn violent world. It simply didn't have the means of proliferating the images of violence that we have. The reality was, in some sense, more violent. Okay, youth, death, and violence, all of which are elements in Dracula himself, if you think about them. And finally, a hard problem, a very, very hard one. The 4th element is, I've had more problem discussing publicly than anything. Dracula is the appropriate representative of the contemporary sexual confusion which is becoming endemic in our decade. A mystery, a major mystery that in the world that we have defined as experiencing a sexual revolution, sexual anxiety increases by leaps and bounds. The most fantastic single statistic that any of us has to confront is that as more and more men and women are able to make it wherever they want to, rape increases by leaps and bounds. Why, if it's so available, is there so much rape? That mystery you have got to solve, and me too for that matter. I'm not putting it all off on you. But so what I wrote in 1972 was, nor is that all. The vampire fascinates a century that is as much frightened as it is exhilarated by its rush towards sexual freedom. Slowly, but in recent years, more unambiguously, his message has been filtering down from our movie screens. In the vampire's embrace, any number of sexual dilemmas are outwitted. His kiss permits all unions, men and women, men and men, women and women, fathers and daughters, mothers and sons. Moreover, his is an easy love that evades the usual failures of the flesh. It is the triumph of passivity, unembarrassing, sensuous, throbbing, violent, and cruel. Now I tried to put that, there's a certain, what is it? You can hear me swinging with my own rhythm as I write. So it tends to be unspecific. And audiences quite properly say to me, what do you really mean? What do you really mean? And so I'll tell you. What I really mean is that from 1923 to the present, 1923 being the date for Nosferatu, which is the first vampire film modeled based on Dracula, as a matter of fact, to have been made, from that time to the present, the value of the image and the reason I haven't told you, and I keep worrying about that clock, I haven't told you how pervasive the vampire is in our lives these days. There have been more than 200 films turning around the word Dracula alone, not to mention the other scores of vampire films. Since this book came out, there have been more than 20 books published on the vampire within the last 3 years. Within the last year, there have been 3, 2 of them bestsellers, Salem's Lot and the new one that's coming out next month called Interview with the Vampire, which has already been sold for $700,000 to the paperbacks. And what fascinates me and demonstrates my point about where we are these days is that so far everybody keeps talking about how much money was paid for it, and no one has even asked whether it's a good book. That's an interesting piece of news. I must tell you, parenthetically, there is also an interview with a vampire in this book, a real live San Francisco vampire, who, for all I know, is now a student at your university. Don't worry, I don't think he really is. That was just meant to, but he might be. He really might be. I don't know what's happened to him. But the point about it, of course, is that if we are all nervous about each other's sexuality, and we don't want to acknowledge that we might have what used to be called latent homosexual tendencies. Now they're simply called homosexual tendencies. Or incest fantasies, or rape fantasies. We can evade them all because the particular form of union that the vampire makes with his victims is experienced as a gesture of embracing, but is unspecific. And that's very soothing. It really, I spent hours watching not the films, but the audiences. You have to see me with a little flashlight, a shaded flashlight in the darkened movie theater, making notes for hours on end, and then every so often turning like this to watch whole families pause. They stop eating their popcorn as the vampire bends, and a silence falls on the theater. And everybody goes, and they hold their breath when he's done. Beautiful. It really, it's a communion gesture. We like it. We like it. The question, of course, is always why. I'm not saying that it's bad to like it. I just want to recognize that we do like it and that the film is serving us in some way, on the one hand, to keep us from learning what we don't want to learn, and on the other, it gives us the kicks that we would have if we finally learned what we were watching. That was then what this book was about, but I would like you to hear on what sort of high moral note it ended on. The entire book is about blood. One newspaper reviewer, you know, when you write books such as I've recently written, you become a patsy for everybody's weirdo humor, so that sometimes a newspaper reporter comes to a lunch appointment and the first thing he orders for me is a Bloody Mary. I don't even drink, you know. Dracula says, I don't drink wine. I don't drink at all. But I'm used to it. All around the country, you didn't do it, David, thank you. The glass of tomato juice is carted out. The book is about blood. But I had to tell my readers this story of just before I left Israel 3 years ago. I went into the Sinai Desert with a Jeep, my wife and a Jeep. I don't know which sequence, how to put that sequence. We went into the Sinai Desert and we drove for 4 days through the Sinai. We drive through the bottom of one stark granite cup after another, bluish red at dawn, blood red at 10 o'clock, leached to a ghostly yellow at noon. Rarely Bedouins by 2s and 3s rise up from no place one can see and ride off toward terrible chipped distances, their tragicomic camels wading through the heat. 2 days of 108 degrees Fahrenheit, of sand and gasoline fumes. Then the mountain is just ahead. Sinai, red. The jeeps lurch. We gasp. There are 3,400 steps to the top. They've been carved into the rock. At the foot of God's blazing mountain, there's a well. The water, the cool, cool, plentiful, sweet water in the midst of his terrible desert, is there for the pilgrim to drink. Water. And that, of course, I had hoped would let my readers know where my head is. My head, I'm interested in water. Sweet, pure water. Baptismal water if you're Christians. The water of salvation if you're thirsty. Whatever you want to call it. Water, not blood. But blood is what needs to be confronted. It has to be confronted because we live in easily the most bloody century in the history of the human race. And that's hard for us to remember because the catastrophes of this century were so neatly organized. Will you keep that in mind, please? I know I'm sounding like some sort of a preacher, but so what? I am a preacher. We forget that this is the bloodiest century of them all because our catastrophes were neatly organized. They happened in Japan with a neat package falling from the sky. They happened in Germany where the filing cabinets were the devices for the destruction of mankind. And if we don't keep that before us, we lend ourselves to becoming first the passive accomplices to the next debacle, and finally, if it really overtakes us, we become the victims themselves. That then was what the message of this book was about. It went right over the heads of almost all the reviewers. Time magazine said that I was writing in a style that could only be called spillane agonistes. I think that's pretty neat. I mean, really neat. Spillane agonistes. Time likes to say such, you know, scissors snipping phrases. I don't know what they thought they were cutting off, but I think they thought they knew. And I would have died that week, because the week that review came out, if the New York Times hadn't also come out side by side and called it the best book on the subject ever written. So that, you know, it's sort of balanced time, and you have to live with it, which reminds me then that I want to talk a little bit No, I'll hold that off till a little later. I'm going to talk with you tonight about the consequences of being a writer, the sort of social, political, financial, spiritual dilemmas. One of the dilemmas is having written a book that looks like this. When a publisher takes a beautiful little book intended for young people, the inside is classic, humanistic, refined, brilliant. This was Straight Arrow's idea of how to sell a book written by the kind of guy I am. They blew it. They really blew it, because this is, you know who this is directed toward? The publishing trade has a word for it. It's called the bubblegum set. The bubblegum set thinks, wowie! And then it opens it up and it reads, the basilisk is a lurid monster of the Middle Ages, whose name is also the cockatrice. Either name is musical and spectacular, and both sound dangerous. Well, I could have, there's some more, there are heavier sections in this book, but it's not for the bubblegum set, but it is about monsters. That's one of the consequences of being interested in monsters. The book after this was written during the October War in Israel. I don't know how aware you are that writers have deadlines, and that professional writers, and I thank the Lord I am one, professional writers pride themselves on meeting their deadlines. We don't say to our publishers the way students say to their teachers, my grandmother had a toothache, and she had to have me, you know, we do say it, but I pride myself that I deliver a book within 2 months of deadline. Now, oh, that's pretty good, you know, a book, you think within 2 months, usually on time, but usually within no later than 2 months. The deadline for this book was fast approaching just as I got to Israel. And I got there 4 days before the war broke out. And I wrote this book in the midst of blackouts and trips to the battlefront, and I got it out. And the problem was how to get it to New York in time to meet the deadline, since the mails were censored and there was a tremendous delay. I bribed an El Al pilot to sneak it out. I mean, we went through the whole business. The Shin Bet, the local CIA might have put us in jail forever for sneaking this thing out to Straight Arrow in time for publication date. After that book, this, as I say, you know, it was done in 3 or 4 weeks, and it's a pleasant little book, and it's not a major effort, and I'm proud of it. After that came this. Oh, I haven't told you. That's not true. That's not true. This book finished. I had already done the research on this one. We went to Israel because I wanted to write another book, a book I want to tell you about, because I do very much want to tell you about it. This book did not make a big smash. It did reasonably well. This book earned a few $100s. This book's doing very, very well. I'll tell you about it in a little while. Between this one and this one is the year in Israel where I went to write a book about Shabbatai Tzvi. Now, you don't know who Shabbatai Tzvi is. Anybody? See? I'm right. You don't. You're not supposed to know. It's okay. After I'm finished, you will know. Someday you will know. I wrote the book called Shabbatai, Messiah of Fire and Clay. I wrote it under contract for Little Brown. My first novel contract. David knows how long I've been writing. I've been, you know, if you can almost tell how long I've been writing. If I tell you I started writing when I was 14, I almost haven't stopped since then. It's a long time. I published a lot of books, but no novel. Published a lot of short stories, but no novel. So this is my first novel, right? I'm excited. Under contract, signed, advance, thousands of dollars for. I went to Israel to write this book because the book is set in Israel. Shabbatai is a 17th century Jewish Messiah who appeared 1647 to 1665 are useful dates, who became an extraordinary force in the lives not just of Jews of that period, but Christians as well, who believed he was the real thing. They really thought he was the new Christ come to judgment. Millions of people sold everything they had. They followed him. The peace of the Turkish Empire was shaken. Really it was. I'm telling you, this is truth and it's history. And he fascinates me, and he's a wonderful, complex guy, and I wanted to write a novel about him since I was 17 years old. I can show you my first draft as a 17-year-old. And lo and behold, Harry Sions, the editor of my other 3 books for Little Brown, thought it was a great idea. Contract signed, off I went, and I wrote a book which a letter from Irving Howe recently has called a tour de force. Irving Howe and my wife and I know that I've written a fine book. I'm now telling you a sad story. While I was writing that book, Harry Sions, my longtime editor, died. Of all the things you have not yet been told in your creative writing classes is what happens to first your personal life and then your career if your editor dies. Editors are the only people in the world who are entitled to immortality, because without them, everything collapses. Harry died. Harry was 67 years old. He's a man of wide-ranging culture, and he could say to me, and he has kept me writing for years because he could say this to me, I used to say to him, Harry, why do you keep publishing my books? I produce one deadbeat book after another. The book on Israel sold 3,000 copies. Do you know what that means? It means nothing. Nothing. It never got out of the bookstores. The bookstores took it off the shelves after 1 week. That's how fast it was a dead book. He said, Leonard, it's quite possible that you will grace the language. If you ever have an editor who can say that to you, kiss any part of him, he'll let you. Just, you know, wherever and whatever. What did Harry then do? He died. He died on me. And I hope your smiles are grieving smiles, as my heart is. He was my good friend, and he died. And the Little Brown's gears went into motion, and they all wrote saying, there, it's all right, you just keep working, it'll be all right. I finished my magnificent book. I delivered it personally to a young, smooth-faced, 31-year-old, bright, hotshot editor who turned it down. He read it. For one thing, he doesn't see why anybody gives a damn about what happened to a dead Jew in the 17th century. He doesn't give a damn. Now, 5 other editors have also said they don't give a damn. They always say, and they write me beautiful letters, they tell me what fine prose it is, and then they say a mysterious thing that you really must encounter someday, and as writers either decide not to commit suicide or commit it. Because what they say is, we don't know how to put this book in the bookstores. Did you even know anybody cared about that? Did you not think that your idea was to write a great book and then somebody would read it and say, yay, or wow, or I don't like it, but you're a fine writer, so we'll print it. That's not how they think. They think of sales meetings, and a book has to have a handle. Did you know it had to have a handle? Not like the handle on the CBs, but a handle. This has a handle. Everybody, you know, the word Dracula is a handle. I could have said almost anything, and it has a handle. But Shabbatai doesn't have a handle. The people who published this book, there are some people in the house, the publishing business being strange, there are some high-ranking people in the corporation who liked Shabbatai. And they persuaded me to submit Shabbatai to them. That was done in July of last year. Yesterday, the final answer came, and it's still no. But you should hear what happened. First, one editor said, I would like it if you could change it to the first person. I thought about that, and I wrote a couple of chapters in the first person, and it was pretty good that way. But it didn't feel like the book I wanted it to be, so I said no. He said, well, I don't like it either, even in the first person, forget it. So I was rejected. I was contented to go somewhere else. But my friends in high places said, Leonard, we'll we'll squirrel it past this guy to a higher editor. And they squirreled it past, and the higher editor said, it won't sell. Okay, that's 2 down. And I said, let me have the manuscript back. And my good friend said, no, we really think it's a great book, so we'll take it to the publisher himself. The high mucky muck who is at the top of the heap. He really is at the top of the heap, and he's a wonderful guy. He's 70-some years old, and I like him very, very much. What you learn is, as you get older in this business, that you can like people who are destroying you. You can learn to like people who are destroying you. It isn't masochism. As they point out, it's our business. Nat, my good friend, read this book. He's been sitting on it since December. And each time I have said to my agent, move it out of there, the agent calls, and then my friends always say, don't disturb Nat right now, because we're just moving. He's got a crisis. The Stephen Weed book came out. They published that. Stephen Weed has priority over me, obviously, you know, and he does. Monday, I privately had a dark night of the soul, and I thought to myself, to hell with my agent, to hell with my good friends, I'm going to call Nat. Nobody calls Nat. He's at the top of the heap. I called Nat, and lo and behold, he wasn't there. But I left a message, and Nat is a good guy. Hear me. He really is a good guy. The next day, he called me. By then, I knew what had happened. He'd already turned it down. And Nat explained to me that he likes the book, but he doesn't like the ending. It has to have an upbeat ending. That word upbeat is going to cut my throat from ear to ear. You know, in real life, Shabbatai blew it. He became a Muslim because the emperor said, unless you become a Muslim, you're dead. And Shabbatai looked around, and it occurred to him that he didn't want to be dead. So he blew it. And that's what my book says. But that's not an upbeat ending. It has to have some kind of other ending. And I understand that, because there are other ways of putting. I don't want to give you my internal problems vis-a-vis the book. I just want you to hear the end of the publishing saga. Nat said, submit it somewhere else. If it's rejected a few more times, then come back to us, and when we have more time, we'll sit down and we'll work something out. Now, do understand that that means he really likes me. I mean that seriously. He really likes me. But no matter how much they like you, if they do not smell black ink instead of red, nothing will happen. And as you see, my book, which might yet grace the language, and Irving Howe, who is America's major and best critic, he's written me such a letter. You know, I've made copies of the letter, and my agent and I are sending them out to publishers saying, see, that's what Irving Howe says. Irving Howe says it's great. Irving Howe says it's great. Irving Howe says it's great. And Irving Howe this week is on the bestseller list. So it's a sick world, people. It's a sick world, and you don't get your just desserts. And I don't think, you know, don't hear me whining. I told you the story not as a whining story, because the only answer to this is to have 5 other projects going. And I have. I have another book coming called The Annotated Guess What? Frankenstein. And 3 other novels, you know, working underhand. I keep wanting to grace that language. If you wait for them, you are cutting your own throat. There is nobody to answer the question whether you're a writer except yourself. Sometimes I think your typewriter has something to say to you, which reminds me, I encourage you all to have electric typewriters, because the electric typewriter talks to you. The other kind of typewriter just waits, but the electric typewriter says, well, and you better do something. I listen to that, and to shut it up, you go like this, you see. So don't get a very modern one that's so silent you can't hear it, but the one that, you didn't hear the Yiddish intonation for that, no. See, a Yiddish mama would say, no, and that's what the typewriter says. Okay. After that really fine novel came this. And this is not a work of fiction, well, not my work of fiction. Bram Stoker wrote it. It's Stoker's Dracula, splendid novel. I argue it's a great work of literature, and I believe it, to which I have appended all sorts of delicious small details that nobody in his right mind would ever think he was interested in. But once you find them, you think, isn't that nifty? And I love it. You find out in this book how much Jonathan Harker paid to take the coach from Bistrica to the Borgo Pass, and whether he had to pay in silver or gold. Well, did you know you cared? You care, you care. When you read it, you'll care. You find out how much it costs to go to the zoo in London. There's a scene that's set in the London Zoo, and I tell you how much it cost to get in, and where the monkey house was, and where the wolves were. You didn't know you cared about that either. You'll care. You find out how there are various recipes mentioned in this book. I provide you with the recipe. I provide you with all sorts of data, which when you get it is delightful to have. For example, I can show you the time of the sunrise and the sunset of every single day of the action of the novel. Now you would say, who cares about that? But if you know anything at all about vampires, what do you know? When can they function? At night. So don't you want to know when it's safe for him to get, you know, he needed to know the time of sunrise and sunset, so you need to know. All right. Now, to do a book like this, you have to have, as I hope you notice, a certain sense of humor, because the reviewers, you know, reviewers don't want to take Dracula seriously. They really don't want to take him seriously. Some, very, very few, but for the most part, this was the most widely reviewed book in America in the month of July of last year. And every reviewer who picked it up wanted to say something, but none of them could say, isn't it magnificent? They all had to say, it's magnificent, but why did he do it? See? Who cares? This is, what do they call it? It's trivia freaks. This is a book for trivia freaks, said they. Well, maybe. I recommend that you read a book by John Livingston Lowes called The Road to Xanadu, which does what I've done for Dracula, he does to Kubla Khan, Coleridge's Kubla Khan, and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. He traces what happened to Coleridge's mind, the books he read, the conversations he had, the voyages that were taking place in those years, and it's like reading a detective story. It really is. And I guess all I'm saying to you is that there isn't only one person inside this head, any more than there's one person inside your own heads. There are half a dozen people inhabiting any one of the heads I'm looking at. One of the heads I discovered to my surprise. You know, I've never published a scholarly article in my entire life. I have never given a colleague an off-print. Do you know what an off-print is? Maybe out here you don't know. Aren't you lucky? Off-prints are an academic reflex. Instead of saying good morning, you hand your colleague a printout of an article you've written in a scholarly journal. And that's what people do. In the world where you publish or perish, this is a way swiftly pointing out to your superiors that you've just published and that you don't intend to perish. So you have off-prints. I never published one in all my life. Who would suppose that I would write a book in which you trace Dracula's steps, his literal footsteps, all through Transylvania? I've got a map. Here's a map of London. All those red marks are where Dracula went. I went there with my camera to find out if, you know, what it looked like. All I'm saying is that in addition to the fiction and the books about Israel and the Haight-Ashbury and all sorts of other stuff, one of the people who lives inside my skull loved doing this, as I now love doing the next book. I'm tracing, I give you my theory because I want you to think about it. Frankenstein is written, as you know, by a woman, written by a very young woman who was constantly pregnant and whose pregnancies ended either in stillbirths or the death of her children within the oldest child. One child grew up, but of 5 children, 4 died. And I have a suggestion for you. When you next read Frankenstein, read it as a woman's book, trying to confront the life processes as a woman experiences them, and finally concluding in her symbolic reaction that men are the most desperately dangerous species on the face of the earth. It is a fear of male novel, just as Dracula is a fear of female novel. It's extraordinary. And if you read Mary Shelley's life, you can see how all this stuff pours in around her, and out of it she makes this perfectly frightening book in which the image, you know, when the creature is formed, he walks out into the world, and at one point Victor Frankenstein, who has made him, calls him an abortion. Critics for centuries, literally centuries, have not picked up on that remark. But I think women should. Well, so I've given you something to worry about, and when the annotated Frankenstein comes out, you'll have to buy it for $15. As now you have to buy this one. Okay. I think I have done the circle. I haven't talked to you about the years when David knew me, for example. I wrote only short stories and poetry. In the last few years, I have not written poetry. What does that mean? I have a friend. You know, everybody has a friend who, if you have a friend like him, you don't need an enemy. You know that kind of friend. He came up to me after this book came out. He said, "Leonard, why would you do a thing like this when you can write poems?" He was like the bad fairy at the wedding, you know. He was putting a curse on me because he doesn't write at all. See, that's the other mystery. Okay. I have no answer for him except that this year, the year before this, I was doing Shabbatai. With the grief of Shabbatai, I haven't told you what happened, that after that young man rejected Shabbatai, my mind went numb for nearly a full year. Numb. And that's why it's useful to have a job. Because my students, God bless them, didn't know that my mind was numb. They continued to come to class, and they continued to ask good questions, and they kept me going. I walked on their heads, as it were, all year long. So it's a very good idea always to have something else to do, because, you know, the death of Shabbatai was like the death of a person. The person dying is you. You must know that. You know, it isn't a long novel. It runs to 400 and some pages, and it took 2 years of one or another sort of work to make. You don't just flush it down the drain. So for nearly a full year, you know, those little blip things on TV, which we're all now being taught, now we know when the lie is that the line gets straight. Well, for you, the line is straight.